Okay, Francesco.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this very stimulating paper. My question is, if according to you, is there a structural necessity that justifies the analogy between the living and the machine? Structural necessity, I'm thinking about what Jacques Derrida says in an unpublished seminars, that the living is a text that interprets text, translates text, produces text, but also to what Bernard Stiegler says, that technique is a supplement of the living, but a supplement that is necessary to the constitution of what it is a supplement. Or because if, I think this is very important, or only in my view, but in another way, it's only a question of metaphor. To use a metaphor to explain a phenomenon, and then a scientist is looking for the best machine that is better to demonstrate about the living what he wants. But if there is a structural necessity, in my view, is more interesting. Thank you.
Yes, I agree, but I would like to twist your argument in the way that the structural necessity is the metaphor. So we have to arrive at a much more nuanced understanding of metaphor. And I wouldn't go so far as Kapp, for example, that there is a structural necessity in the sense of that there is an essence that unites technology and human bodies. Somehow, human beings managed to survive by technology, by inventions, by inventing cultures. And part of the ensemble, among this ensemble of technology, the immersion of language came up with metaphors, not as artful ornaments for saying something in a more decorative way, but for pointing to direction where direct experiences, pointing into direction where direct experiences lack, where we want to make sense of things, something beyond what we can grasp, where human understanding cannot or has not yet arrived at. So it is actually expressive of this inventive capability of this being that only existed thanks to its own inventiveness and to the inventions that made us and not the Neanderthalers arrive today.
Before I pass it to Ian James, I have my own question I'd like to ask.
You're jeopardizing your role.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry about that. It's actually, it's not that much of a question. It's really kind of a comment, but it's really. I thought that was extremely interesting. Technology, insofar as technology is a kind of know-how, it. Like a materialized know-how, in a Stiegler sense, know-how kind of precedes knowledge. Knowledge kind of, it's we always arrive at objectivities, at models of understanding through practices, various practices for arriving at these models, right? We have to reconstruct, we have to construct these models. So it seems that when we turn these devices around and try to model the brain, it seems that we're constantly using the know-how, the technology that we've developed in order to interpret the world, and turns out that that's all. All we know is basically all we can in practice do. So it's this. I guess my question is: can we ever get out of this cycle? And what would this utopian kind of pure objectivity look like if we were able to find this pure practice outside of know-how that would somehow, that would give us a picture of ourselves and a picture of the outside without kind of beyond our own practices. And I think there's already some of this in your talk, but I'm not sure if...
First of all, I can't resist making the comment that obviously many brain researchers were so fascinated that they thought about ways how to access by means of their most recent research technologies their own minds, and more or less in all cases, sometimes that were some fancy drug-like experiences, but for most of the cases just the breakdown of the experimental situation. This loop, this reflexive loop, is not necessarily programmed on productivity. More to the question at the end of your comment, I've hoped to convince you that the utopia cannot be the true nature of the human brain, and in this sense cannot be the EU flagship project of the brain in silico. The utopia would, in my sense, be to, and I think that is also the role for me as a historian of science, but also for, I think, humanities scholars, to keep this space open of constructive, of productive work, and to keep alternatives open, not giving in to just the latest insight from the neurosciences that almost always comes with gestures of closure, of reaching out to understanding depression, of how to medicate disbehaving adolescents, etc.
Thank you. I was very, very grateful for your drawing our attention to the voodoo correlation debate, particularly since it seems to me that if that analysis is correct, it's still rampant in so much neuroscience, and particularly in those neuroscientific experiments that get highly mediatized. And I think that's true in the UK at least. And so in that context, I wanted to ask you a little bit about social neuroscience as you characterized it. And it seems to me that, and I may be wrong about this, but neuroscience sort of has to approach the brain as an object and with a broadly objectivist ontology. And even if one frames the nature of that object in complex ways, say through Bachelard and Canguilhem as an object of science, it still has a certain sort of objective status. Sure. Yes. I think it's Merleau-Ponty in The Visible and the Invisible, I think, who talks about the psychosocial and social psychology, if you like, never being its object never being reducible to an objective or an objectivist ontology. So I'm wondering whether, when social neuroscience couples its complex object, which is on one hand neuroscientific, and I love the way you characterize it, it seems to me a very exciting field, so this isn't really a criticism of that, I don't have that competence, but I'm wondering whether the two registers that it's marshalling are not still, in fact, registers from very heterogeneous realms, one which is an objectifiable realm approachable through an objectivist science, and the other which is a radically unobjectifiable realm. And so whether it still has to rely on some form of correlationism between the two. It may not be, clearly not voodoo correlation, very complex one and perhaps a more productive one, but there seems to be a kind of a void or a gap that opens up between the two realms, which is unbridgeable. And you seem to have shown the way in which the technological metaphors act as a kind of a Hermes across that abyss between the two realms. And is it a problem that it may still rely on that correlation? Is that a limit? That's it.
Yes. Thank you very much. First of all, there are literally tens of thousands of neuroscientists, so it's an enormously diversified field. So the brain doesn't exist as there's the neurosciences. So I speak in general relations about a field that that one cannot capture under these general notions. But I think there are tensions in the way that you describe. One is the problem that you need measures of control, of objectification. Right now, for example, this is part of the Connectome project, where they want to implement a global archive of connectivity data that obviously tries to find some new measure of significance of a wealth of data that the neuroscientists themselves are not yet sure what to make out of. Because the visualization techniques, and particularly the imaging algorithm that information sciences gives us, are so powerful that with these methods we can deconstruct the conclusions from the neurosciences from just 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But the plasticity of data manipulation is so overwhelming that there's a rich debate right now what new standards, what new protocols to implement. So that is just for a science studies person just fascinating. The other is that there are indeed attempts to do the correlation by retesting a single person, and do this not just for evaluating the data, but to engage in a therapeutic interaction with the visualization device. Right after this meeting, I traveled to a meeting of an international research team that does that. I'm not yet sure what to think of that, whether this is Brave New Worlds or whether opening up brave neuro worlds. We'll see.
Hi, thank you. I was really interested in your words about Freud. Along the lines of the insufficiency of Freud's technical and visual metaphors to articulate the psychic function. And I wondered if you think that it changes anything at all to emphasize the fact that the origin of psychoanalysis is first a technical practice, and that the theory of the mind then comes out of that, to think about psychoanalysis as a technical object or form of technical practice. I don't have any idea about that, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
Yes, I would differentiate between between various forms of practices. So I'm certainly critical of the new attempts, of the new readings of Freud as a modern-day neuroscientist avant la lettre. I don't see that there is a direct line from him dissecting nerve cells to the neuroimaging of trauma. I do think that there is a serious rupture that is very important to keep conceptually between the Freud's being educated at Vienna in the experimental sciences of the day, and the Freud that writes on psychoanalysis. But I do think that his practices, or that the practices that he learned in France, of interacting with other human beings that have suffered something, that would be the kind of practices around which, from which psychoanalysis emerged.
Thanks a lot. I'd like to ask you about the politics of the science as you see it. I was wondering why, and hopefully this might sort of tie into the first two questions that were asked. There are accounts of cognitive science that try not to objectify the brain as something aside from its embodied environment. I mean, for the Fourier group, Anthony Camero, radical embodied cognitive science, movements like this. The benefits of these is that, well, they move to remove themselves from some of the representational sort of science assumptions that play a part in the methodologies that are used. My question is there any economic, political reason why these movements aren't being listened to more? Maybe as a secondary sort of addendum to that, is there a reason why some of the more dominant trends in cognitive science are being listened to more?
The easy answer is simply because they are the dominant ones. I must know more about the groups you have identified. I was always wondering what will come out of cognitive science as that once flourished from the, I don't know, 60s to 80s or so, because it was this fascinating anti-mimetic program of explaining the brain. So there must be entire groups deeply frustrated by this dominance of the mimetic representations that now get all the public attention. The easy answer is, I think, not all in all the stupid ones. The visualization technique are fascinating. There's no doubt about that, and they go hand in hand with other dominant strands in the biological sciences. For example, the geneticists, and their failure was much more massive than the reductionism during the decade of the brain, but nonetheless money is being poured into genetics, and they do fantastic research, but they certainly didn't deliver any of the promises which with the Human Genome Project was started. The contrary, instead of genetic determinism, now we have epigenetics. Very, very powerfully arrived at by means of this massive research funding. Although every scientist knows that this research won't deliver the easy solution and explanation in drugs that are always somewhere in the legitimatory lines, this is at least the public image of the science policy, science popularization debate.
I'd like to come back to the question with Francesco, the relationship between techniques, technology and brain. As you know, Walter Ong says that Plato's brain, or Plato's mind, is a literate mind. And Marianne Wolf, we will see now in a video recording, says this literate mind is supported by a reading brain. And this brain is transformed by the apprenticeship of the practice, of the learning of writing and reading. Today, we are confronted to the question of digital brain, in the youth particularly. And Marianne Wolf herself works and studies the transformations of the brain by the digital, not only with 500 children, but with his own children, 2 boys, 2 sons, she says. And I think we must distinguish between the technologies that we don't internalize for being socialized. For example, in our society, if you can't read, you can't be socialized correctly. Now, if you can't use a computer, you can't enter into this community. Maybe it's better for you, I don't know. I don't believe that, but some people say that. I don't agree with that. Now, I believe that the question of internalization of the technicity is the first question of the human brain. And it could be interesting, for example, to compare between taxi drivers in London with the famous hippocampus transformation of their learning of the map of London, the violinist and the transformation of the brain of the violinist, and a movie maker like him, for example, an operator of camera, which is also transformed by the practice. It's not at all the same situation to watch a movie on the television and to make movies for television, and you have a transformation of your brain. So my question is, would you agree, not necessarily for saying with me, but for discussing with me, that the brain is the historical or the historial or the geschichtlich organ, because this is a question of history. It is of the social time. History is not only the psychic time, the psychical time, but the social time.
Yes, it is. There are actually a number of studies that have looked into that, and the invention of short messaging, for example, inflated the representational area of the thumb, because the thumb was underused before. The fascinating thing for me is from science study is the coincidence of these media innovations, these new technologies, with a brain theory that allows to explain it. Until recently, the dominant brain theory was that at birth the number of neurons is there, and a bit of hardwiring develops, and during adolescence there's some form of rewiring, but that's it. And so with this shift in emphasis on dynamic processes and plasticity, we have a kind of positive feedback between our explanations of what is going on in the brain and the technocultural evolution. That's one hand. That's one comment. And the other is, yes, in a certain sense, I do think that brains are our history. Though that would not mean that deep history is the solution to historical questions, the other way around.
The gist of good papers is to stimulate the tinkering with images and the ideas, and that's the effect that your paper made on me. And I'd like to come back to the issue of metaphor. Metaphor, if you take it in the philological sense, is a transferal or something from a place to another place, the Aristotelian more or less definition. Well, if I have understood well your question, Francesco, you wanted to be spared even this work transferring a thing from a space to another, because you wanted to find a structural similarity so that you could find already there the link. I would suggest to move the other way around, and thinking the distance instead between the two phenomena. I'm thinking to the famous image of Lautréamont, of the sewing machine and the umbrella meeting. What if we think to a brain scan as a sewing machine and the supposed emotion as the umbrella? And what if we consider the work of association as the study of a series of sewing machines and a series of umbrella, and the intervention of the researchers as a kind of arrangement or a composition in the lesson terms, so that what is requested is their present, their position, their work in order to make this composition meaningful. Would you follow this path?
I would have to rephrase something of my answer to Paolo. There's a for me quite helpful paper by the Hans Blumenberg that I quoted here, that I think has not been translated, that links anthropology and rhetoric, and where he explains why we have to arrive at such a rich understanding of rhetoric in order to coming to terms with the problematic situation of anthropology. And in this sense, yes, I think it's perhaps three. There are three aspects that are important to this, to the gap, to the difference. First of all, I side with Rauschenberg, and that living in the gap is the task and not the closure of the gap, the in between. It is. I think there is something very characteristic and important for human relation, that is mere artificiality of the arts. So the mere inventiveness of any invention, it's the uselessness, so to speak. So the difference. But that's only one thing. So the expression of potentiality. So the other is obviously that we are dealing here with things that also exist as things. So we can't come up with anything, but have to discover obstacles, material resistances. So that's I think the second trajectory, where this working out the differences is quite unfolds in very interesting ways. And the third direction is the interaction, the social life, that you have to convince someone that this is actually an interesting long jump, and not just ridiculous or nuisance.
Thank you very much for all your comments and for Cornelius Borck's.
Thank you for the questions.